Welcome to In the Black, where we celebrate stories of transformation, resilience, and rising into the life you were meant to live. I'm your host, Araceli, and this space was created to amplify voices often overlooked. Women who've come through the fire with wisdom, strength, and heart. Whether you're here for healing, clarity, or just good conversation, you belong here. Welcome. Today's guest is a woman whose life and work embody the essence of transformation. Donna Simmons is the author of Ashes to Flame, Transforming Trauma into Purpose, a title that speaks directly to the heart of her journey. As a survivor of child marriage and lifelong trauma, Donna has turned her personal pain into public purpose. A powerful speaker, writer, and advocate, she has delivered keynotes across the US and internationally, standing as a beacon of courage and resilience for survivors everywhere. Her testimony has helped reshape child marriage laws in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana, and her advocacy is far from over. She continues to fight for the protection and empowerment of trauma survivors, dedicating her whole life to meaningful change at the personal, legislative, and societal level. But beyond her professional achievements, Donna is a mother, a truth teller, and a fierce light in spaces where silence once reigned. Whether you've survived trauma or want to stand in support of those who have, Donna's story is not only powerful, it's necessary. Let's welcome to the show Donna Simmons.
Thank
Welcome, Donna.
thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you today.
Yes, absolutely. I am so glad that your manager reached out and sent me your story. And it's just, of course, I had to say yes. So tell us a little bit. I know I introduced you.
Yeah.
Just tell us a little bit lightly about yourself and yeah, anything you'd want to share about who Donna Simmons is.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. And so I'll share with who I am now, really, and the space that I'm in. I am the mother of two girls. I am a wife. I've been with my current husband for about 3 years now. And I am a bonus mom to a wonderful little 8-year-old boy as well. You may actually see my dogs kind of walking back and forth in the background. I have three dogs, two of which are pretty larger breeds, and then one who's a little gal. She's part Chihuahua, part Boston Terrier. And then I have a couple of cats. And I share all this because I'm surrounded by love. And I am so grateful for that because that hasn't always been the case. And for me to be able to embrace the fact that I am worthy of that love is really bringing my life full circle. I did grow up in an environment that was extremely abusive and neglectful. That ended up making me vulnerable to being preyed on by a person that was in a position of authority over me. And so, my life took a trajectory that was extremely painful. But ultimately, as you mentioned during the intro, I fought to create change because I decided that the shame was not mine to carry and that I had the responsibility to move forward and help at changing laws that would end up protecting kids from being exploited like I was.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, I have so many questions. So, when you said that a person of authority,
Mm-hmm.
mine happened to be my father. So I
Oh,
was curious as to
yeah.
like what was that, and then how at one point, and I'm sure there's going to be a question about it later.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, did you decide that you weren't? This isn't you. Like this isn't your shame to carry,
Mm-hmm.
to make that difference.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So for one thing, thank you very much for sharing that with me. I know that's, as many times as we may share things, it is never easy to disclose that. So I really appreciate you trusting me with that. Um, mine started with my dad as well. He was not my biological dad, although I grew up thinking that he was. He was my mother's husband, and he actually married my mother when she was 13 years old. And at that point, she already, or, she had only completed the eighth grade, but he had already had two sons from his first marriage and had served in the Korean War, just to give you an idea of what the age disparity was between them. So, flash forward so many years, and when I was born in the 80s, he ended up, abusing me when I was about 5 years old. That's my earliest memory of that. When I disclosed that to my mother, she did not comfort me. She didn't provide any, nurturing or anything. I think the ultimate devastation of that early sexual abuse for me was, I mean, yes, absolutely, the abuse itself was horrendous, but I think even more painfully and perhaps even more impactfully for years was her reaction to me telling her. She very much shamed me and told me it was my fault. And she also said, and I go into the details of this in my book as well, but she also said things like, "Are you trying to make me jealous?" I mean, just things that like you don't say to a child when they tell you that something horrific has happened to them. And so, of course, in hindsight, I can see she definitely had her own trauma that she was carrying that she hadn't processed. Um,
Two
but
follow-up questions.
yeah, of course.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Um, so how old were you when you reached out and like said something to your mom? And then also, were her parents aware that she was getting married to this older man?
Yeah. So there are a lot of parallels between my mother's life and mine. My mother's father passed away when she was 11, and her mother was fine with her getting married. My mom was one of 10 kids too. And this was growing up in a very rural part of Kentucky, Macquarie County, Kentucky, which, even if you research to this day, it is one of the poorest counties in the entire United States. I think the last I checked, the average household income was for like, single people was like 17,000 a year, if that tells you anything. So like well below the poverty line. And it's been like that for years. So being one of 10 kids, and I go into all the intersectionality between poverty and generational abuse as well in my book. Um, but her mother was chomping at the bit to get her at the door. And so that was one of the things that made her vulnerable to, being victimized and exploited through underage marriage. Um, yes, so I was 5 when I disclosed to her, and it wasn't immediately after it had happened, but it was pretty soon after. And I remember telling her, like, just crying hysterically because I was so confused. I just wanted affection, and I already did not have a good relationship with my mother. I was very fearful of her. And she would say things that instilled a lot of fear in me, but then she also would beat me physically. So, these things went into me just like walking around in this constant state of being afraid something was going to happen. My fight or flight and freeze responses were formed at extremely young ages. So when I did disclose to her at 5, I remember telling her, I don't know if this was wrong because I didn't. I knew that it's not what I wanted to happen. I just wanted to cuddle with my dad. And, what ended up happening was so confusing to me because you can't help the experience that you have of physical sensations, but you also know if something doesn't feel right to your emotional body. And so that's what I was trying to convey in, an extremely young and difficult, clumsy way at 5 years old. And her response very much made me feel like there was something wrong with me.
I mean, you're learning at
Yeah.
5 years old, especially. You're just absorbing and learning from guidance and leadership, which you
Right.
had none of. So you would not know this is not normal.
Yeah.
There's something within you that knows it, but you're not sure of it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in some cases, you some kids might not pay attention to that internal, like, whoa, there's something off there. And then
Mm-hmm.
they would think, okay, this is normal. This is what humans do
Right.
because you have no, you don't, you know, you don't come out into the world being born and like having this everything programmed into your head. Sorry, I'm digressing. Okay.
No, you're fine. Everything that you said is extremely valid, though, because we're not born into this world with a script of how things should be, you know? And so, what you were describing very much reinforces the fact that your barometer with what is normal in life is set by the adults that teach you that at young ages. And unless you start having experiences and observations with people that are, healthy and do not operate in toxic manners, then you grow up internalizing the toxicity that you experience as being the only thing available to you. You don't know any better. And that was very much my experience growing up. And that is what ended up making me vulnerable to be preyed on, by a person in a position of authority over me later on as well. The way that that happened, and when I initially said person in a position of authority, that was a mental health technician at a place called Charter Behavioral Health. They existed back in 1998. I was 14 years old. They actually conveniently filed bankruptcy in 1999 and shut down multiple facilities across the US. You can actually look up the expose that was done on them by CNN. They had multiple reports of their staff abusing kids in various ways, whether it was excessive physical force, whether it was grooming and sexual abuse. The kids that went to charter were ones that were labeled as having behavioral issues, right? And what we know is that when kids have experienced early childhood abuse, they go on to become angry teenagers. And that's normal. It's normal for teenagers to be angry in general. They're coming into their own, they're finding their way. But when you compound early life abuse with situations, then the teenager, those adolescent stages, you're so consumed with grief. The only emotion that you can really tune into is anger. And so acting out becomes very normal. Acting out through substance use or self harm. For me, I started smoking pot when I was 13. And, my dad had been diagnosed with cancer when I was 12. So I ended up taking care of him, that we had like a hospital bed and everything in our living room. He was given, his cancer was so advanced at the time, he was only given 6 months to live. And so, I took care of him for the majority of that time because my mom was off doing whatever she was doing. And so, that coupled with the abuse, coupled with a complete, lack of engagement in any healthy manner by my mom, made me start acting out again, smoking pot at 13. I became bulimic. That was another thing that I really struggled with early on. And then, when my dad passed away and my mom would continue to try to beat me, I finally had enough and I started standing up to her. And I talk about that in detail in my book as well. But that was the reason that I ended up going to charter, was because I was labeled one of those out of control teenagers. And instead of receiving the help that I needed, I was groomed by a predator that was there at the facility using his position to see the vulnerabilities of kids and then manipulate them. Now, my case ended up even more extreme than that because my mom let me have a dating relationship with him after I was released. And then 2 years after that, she let me marry him at 16. He was 31. I mean, and here's the other thing I'll say about that as well. One of the most devastating parts of that is that I absolutely needed therapy. I desperately needed therapy and some type of coping skills at that age. The fact that I went to a facility to obtain those skills, it could have been helpful to me, but instead I was preyed upon and further victimized, and my vulnerabilities were exploited. And honestly, for so many years, I wasn't even able to seek out therapy and feel safe in that and stick with it consistently because of the fact that I had such significant trust issues within that system. And so much of my own inner work I've had to do on my own, and that was exhausting. Now, I did end up finding a therapist that was very trustworthy and leaning into that, and of course, other modalities as well. But, to have that just completely stripped away, it was even more demoralizing than all of the other things that I had experienced as well. And I would equate it to what victims of, priest abuse experience as well, because, when you're relying on some person that's in an authoritative position to help you and they take advantage of that, that does something even deeper to your own sense of character.
Absolutely. And this is exactly why I have this podcast. For one, it's because, like we were saying before, if you don't know any better, this is what you grew up with.
Right.
You won't, you would probably still be married to that and have be miserable, unhappy, and just have another child. And like they would probably continue that, mirror that. But to have you share this to hopefully help others who can't tap within and like see like, whoa, there's something here that needs to be
Hmm.
broken, like that cycle needs to be broken, to share your
Right.
story that it is possible, because there are people out there who they don't know that that isn't normal, and
Right.
that you can make a difference, and that this doesn't have to be your life. And also, I wanted to add, I'm going to go and tag where this happened and you spoke of it, the CNN part.
Hmm.
So for listeners who
Hmm.
want to go in there and take a look at that, I will insert it. And then, of course, your book, so that people can go into depth about reading that. And I wanted to ask, I had like all these things in my brain. I should write it down. Oh, so the father that you were taking care of because he got cancer, he was your,
Yes.
and you ended up, okay, wow.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that was the other thing as well. And, this is honestly one of the reasons that I wrote my book to begin with, because there's so much inner conflict that happens with survivors of childhood sexual abuse, abuse in general. But, for me specifically, I had such a horrifically strained relationship with my mother that my father, even though, there was certainly abuse, with her being so abusive from such an extremely young age and me not feeling that I could talk to her about anything, my dad was the person that I paradoxically would go to for comfort and attention, because even though he was abusive, he provided me with those things that I didn't get from her. And as a child, you're seeking connection, you're seeking that nurturing. And so he would sit down with me when he would be home. He was a long distance truck driver. So, he was home most weekends, not every weekend, but most. But, I primarily wasn't around him during the week. But when he would be home, he would sit down and play checkers with me, or Uno, or watch movies, or, whatever those, normal bonding experiences between a parent and child would be. And I didn't have that with my mom. My mom would not be affectionate with me, for one thing. And, for the other, if I wanted to do things like play games with her or whatever, that was something that she would get really frustrated with me over. There was just, no time, no capacity for me. And so, that was one of the things that was so confusing to me about the relationship with my dad. And I write very candidly about this in Ashes to Flame, is that even though he abused me in such an insidious way, I still feel like I was closer to him than I was my mom. And I totally understand cognitively that what he did was manipulative. It was very grooming, it was extremely abusive. It's really hard to reconcile that as a child, because he was my only source of love. And so through my own healing journey, I've had to reconcile the fact that if, I confront the fact that he was abusive, one of the reasons I have such a hard time internalizing that is because, does that mean he didn't actually love me? And if so, who loved me? And if nobody loved me, does that mean I'm unlovable? And that is one of the core dysfunctions of childhood sexual abuse, is that sense of, equating your value, equating affection with something that is gratifying to another person. And I carried that with me into my adulthood, throughout my teenage years and to my adulthood. My dad, as far as I can remember, and I do have certain periods of my life that I can't really remember as well as others. As far as I can remember, that type of abuse by my dad stopped by the time that I was around 9 years old. But I still, especially with the experiences that I had and equating affection to being sexualized, I carried that into my adolescence. So, at 11 years old, I was engaging in activities that I certainly should not have been, with boys that were either a couple years older than me or sometimes quite a few years older than me. That was my way of feeling like I fit in, and it's a very dysfunctional way of looking at things. But that is part of when I talk about throwing off shame, that is a big part of it, because I carried shame about the experience itself that happened with my father. But then I also carried so much shame about my own responses to it, whether it was my body's responses, whether it was the way that I acted out as a teenager. And I had to get to the place within me where I realized, and part of this was becoming a mother, to be able to get to the place within me to realize that all of those younger versions of me were doing the best that they could with the information they had available. And to be able to put that down and say, I genuinely deserve so much more and I am lovable, regardless of if anybody else had the ability or capacity to give me that love. I am lovable. And that's when the healing really started beginning for me.
Oh, that's so well said, and almost got me into tears. I love that. But it's so true, and you spoke that so well.
Thank you.
Um, okay, let's stop going rogue here, and I'm gonna pull up one other question. So let's talk about a little bit of your child marriage. So,
Mhm.
what was that like? Did you know that going into it, did you want to marry this person? Did you know there was something wrong? Just take us through kind of what that process was like and what was happening
Mhm.
to you at that time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So and I use the term dated with quotes because there was nothing dating about it. It was a predatory situation. But my mother let me see my perpetrator for a couple of years before she married me off to him. And at first, he was very manipulative. He like pretended to be the knight in shining armor, right? And he had access to my files. So he knew all of my issues, all of the things I had disclosed in therapy there at that facility. And he was able to utilize that to groom me and to fulfill this need that he knew that I had that I didn't even know that I had, right? Which is for some type of nurturing, some type of unconditional love. So that's how he portrayed himself. And he would say things to me. And again, this is starting when I was 14. He would say things to me like, you are so much more mature than the average 14-year-old, and you're so much more intelligent, and age is really just a number when you have such intelligence and you really have a good direction and you know so much more than the adults, and all these things that would build me up and feel like I was more on his playing field than I was with kids my age, right? And so he was able to utilize his own skills and access to my information to manipulate me into feeling that our situation was okay. The other part is that a couple of years into that, I had spent my spring break with him. And again, I write in detail about this in Ashes to Flame as well. But that was my first time that I really realized that something was wrong. And I was 16. Had really just turned 16. My birthday's at the end of January, spring break's in March, you know. And so I spent a week with him. His mother, his biological mother, who certainly has her own mental challenges, had come over to the apartment threatening to tell me something. And his reaction to it was so violent and just so ridiculous. It was obvious that there was something he was hiding. But at that time, I had already had 2 years of grooming, right? And plus had been raised in a very chaotic and toxic environment. So I did not see this as an opportunity to, move away from him. I saw this as an opportunity at that age to protect him because that's what I felt my role was. And it's also very reinforcing of how we end up feeling about our parents, which I think is another reason that a lot of, child abuse is not disclosed because we have these inner conflicts around the relationships with our parents. And so we take on this identity as protector in that case, even if we're hurting. Our focus isn't to protect ourselves, it's to protect those that are supposed to be taking care of us. So that is what ended up happening with him. And then after that, so the police got involved in that situation. It was just a nightmare. And that, with the police getting involved, that I think is what put the seed in his mind that he needed to marry me because I had to be interviewed by a detective about what had happened. Long story short, he ended up pulling a gun on his mom and she went and filed a police report. Again, I go into the details, surrounding that in Ashes to Flame. But because I had to be interviewed by the detective, I think he became very concerned with, the detective was going to see here he was, a 31-year-old man who had a 16-year-old in his apartment on her spring break. So why was that happening? And so with that, he offered my mom $1,000 to marry me, and she agreed to it. One of the things that was so heart wrenching about that, I was taken down to Tennessee, down to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, for the wedding to occur. And it wasn't some big wedding. It was literally a shotgun wedding. We went to the clerk's office. My mom said, when we walked into the clerk's office, my mom said to the clerk, yeah, I'm here, but I've got a minor that I need, to sign to be married. And the clerk didn't even look up from her computer when she said, oh, which one's the minor? It was just so transactional. Like, that didn't set off some alarm bell, And I do remember at that point feeling really unseen, literally and metaphorically. So that also kind of set off some alarm bells. But again, who was I to speak up and say anything? Like, this was the only guy, aside from my dad, who had already passed away. This was the only person that had shown me any affection and attention. So that's what I navigated towards. So, when the wedding occurred and then I ended up moving to Indiana with him, um, then, I ended up having to drop out of 10th grade. There was just so many things. I worked at a grocery store for $6.25 an hour, and I mean, high school dropout, working full time. It was just a horrible situation. Now, what got me to the point where I decided I had to do something about it and, start speaking out. I was 19 when I ended up leaving. I had already had a child from that relationship. And the judge, when, I had gotten away and was going through the divorce process, the judge gave him custody of my child because on paper, and here I was at that point making $8 an hour, right? And, I didn't have a high school education. I didn't have my GED. He had graduated high school. He had his bachelor's degree. He had earning potential, even though during the time that I was with him, the income was him exploiting me through strip clubs. Like, he had me working there, right? So he wasn't working. He would spend his days getting high and drunk. Well, that's what I had to do. But he used that to discredit me. He used my lack of income. Like, everything was just portraying me as just this incapable monster, might as well be a statistic. And there wasn't anyone telling me that things could be different. So when I did get out of that situation, I was determined to become the polar opposite of what I'd grown up with, and also to be able to demonstrate to myself and others that I was capable. I had this dream of being able to get custody of my daughter at some point, and it took me years to be able to do it, but the stars aligned just right to where when she was 11 years old, she did come to live with me. I was able to get temporary custody of her for a few years. And of course, that relationship was extremely strained at that point because I had all this period of time, that I didn't get to spend with her when she was younger. Um, but, through that experience, through having my younger daughter, who was from a different relationship, who actually just turned 18 and is about to go off to college now, um, you know, raising her, these were all things where, seeing her go through all these different stages of her life and seeing myself through her in these various stages really brought forth this awareness of what I should have been able to expect from people that were tasked with taking care of me. And so realizing that helped me slough off that shame and also realize the atrocity that is the lack of legal protections for kids. And the fact that in our country, since the year 2000, there have been well over 300,000 cases of child marriage that have occurred across our nation. This is literally giving predators a license to abuse. It is literally letting them hide statutory rape behind a marriage license. And for me, part of my purpose in this life is to share my experience to say this has to stop happening to kids. We cannot address things like poverty and generational trauma and, so many other intersecting factors if we're allowing exploitation and abuse of kids to occur through legal means. I mean, it's completely hypocritical.
Wow. Yeah, what you're doing is so amazing. I definitely want to get into that too. Can you take us into that pivotal moment that you saw, like, whoa, this is not right. I need to get out?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, there had been so many things that had happened, but when my daughter was a baby, my oldest daughter, I remember one day he was trying to convince me to do something that I felt really uncomfortable with. And I felt that he was going to try to use that experience to harm somebody else. And so I put my foot down and said, no, I'm not doing it. And his response to that was to tackle me to the ground and begin choking me. And my daughter, she was just a little baby at the time. And she was on the floor in pretty close proximity to where we were, on her tummy. And all of a sudden, she lifts her head up and she just starts laughing. And that to me just shook the core of me because in her mind, I mean, she's a baby, in her mind, her mommy and daddy are wrestling or playing or what have you. And that laughter made me realize that if I did not get out of that situation, she was going to grow up normalizing that, just as I had grown up normalizing so many of the behaviors that my parents had. And so, that was really the moment that gave me the awareness I had to come up with a plan. I wasn't able to leave right away at that point. I had to start planning. I was unfortunately working at a strip club at that point as well. I had no credibility. I was, spending my days trying to take care of her, maybe getting 2 and 3 hours of sleep until I had to be in the club at night. Oftentimes getting there at 7 in the evening and working until 4 o'clock in the morning and then coming home and doing it all over again. So, but, being able to secretly stash away money, ultimately quitting there, getting a job making a heck of a lot less money, but what felt like a more honest and comfortable living. Um, you know, I we had when I left there, I went to work for this place at little bohemian shop here in Louisville, Kentucky. It's called Electric Ladyland. If any of your listeners are from Louisville or even listen to Jimi Hendrix, then they'll know what that reference is from. But that little shop became my lifeline. I was not making very much at all. I think at that point it was like $9 an hour, and they had me managing the store. So but I was able to start putting money back from the tip jar that we had where people would come in and, buy records or pipes or incense or whatever. And they had a tip jar set up for those of us that worked there. And a lot of people would tip. And so, I would take my earnings from that. And that was my little secret stash to start, raising money to be able to afford my own apartment. That's and not to be overly verbose, but I do want to circle back real fast on getting an apartment because it's important to note I tried to leave my perpetrator on two different occasions and I couldn't because I could not enter into a contract and rent my own apartment. Even though I was technically emancipated, right? Because I was married, because I was still a minor, I didn't have the same legal rights. Same with going to a domestic violence shelter. I tried to go to a domestic violence shelter one night and was turned away because I was not yet 18. And again, how do you get help when you're in this legal gray area where child protective services can no longer get involved because you're married? But at the same time, you can't even access a domestic violence shelter because you're not an adult. I mean, it's again, the system is not set up in such a way that is truly supportive. It's set up in such a way that perpetuates harm.
Wow. So you got married at 16 and then you pretty
Mhm.
much wanted to leave at 17. That's pretty quick too. That's wow.
Yeah.
Often, we have like something happen in our lives where it's a single moment realization or a person that sparks the path toward healing.
Mhm.
So, was there a turning point in your story when you began to see yourself not just as a survivor, but as someone with a mission?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I had gotten to the point where, and this happened in my early 30s. I'd gotten to the point where I had really stabilized things. I had gotten myself out of poverty. I got my GED. I earned my bachelor's degree while raising my youngest daughter basically on my own. I did all of these things, landed myself a good job where I was getting promotion after promotion at a company I worked for 13 years. I was well respected. I had friends, you know, all of these things on the surface was just wonderful. And it took me accomplishing that to really be able to turn within and realize that the things people didn't see, like my anxiety, like that inner voice that was constantly questioning whether or not I'm good enough or capable enough or, consumed with imposter syndrome because even though I very much had the same capabilities and had demonstrated success, I could be in a room with five other people with the same successes and feel like I didn't belong, right? So all of these things within that didn't match the external world I had created for myself, I had to start working on that. And as I started doing that, I realized, in part through community and talking with other people, that I could make a difference. And I was not the definition of what I had started off with. I was the definition of who I wrote myself out to be, which was the life I had created for myself. And that really sparked this interest in me in, understanding how on earth I could have even been in the position at 16 years of age to be handed over to a predator legally. So I started doing all this research and pulling back data. And I started off in my home state of Kentucky, looking at how many underage marriages had occurred in Kentucky since the year I was married off back in 2000, and found that just in Kentucky alone, almost 11,000 cases had occurred between 2000 and 2015. And over 80% of those cases were between a minor and an adult. So this is not, a minor marrying a minor. This is a minor and an adult. And so, through that and seeing the huge age disparity, like in one case, there was a 13-year-old girl that was married off to a 33-year-old man and she was pregnant. There was a 15-year-old girl married to a 52-year-old man. She was also pregnant. And so many more examples I could give you. That became my mission. It was like, oh no, oh no. I not only did I survive this, I recognized that what I went through was wrong and that I was going to break that cycle for my kids. And I broke that cycle for my kids. And now it's my responsibility to take that further and expand that protection to other kids that don't have anybody to fight for them. And it's also, if we look at, our lineage, the legacy that we want to live, this fight is about girls that haven't even been born yet as well, because we need to start building a society now that cares more about protecting children than it does protecting predators.
Absolutely. Ugh, I just so Oh, all right. Um, well, I am just excited that you are so impressive. Like the fact
Well,
that
thank you.
yeah, you're just one of the reason why this podcast exists. Again, it's you're just not staying silent. You're doing something about it to, like you said, break the the generational patterns that have occurred
Hmm.
and find ways to help the system because there is, you know, no one would realize that the system is rigged or not,
Hmm.
set up in a way for situations like this. So the fact that you're bringing light and others, I'm sure, bringing light to these situations and making a difference. And these are stories that you don't hear in the news. These are things that people are working their whole life's work into creating these small little changes that are so big, but
Yeah.
somehow they don't get mentioned, you know, in the news. So it's crazy to me. But okay. So with the amazing things that you are doing to make a real difference here, were there moments, because to me it just seems unfathomable to go up to lawmakers and like, hello, I don't belong here. Here's me trying to talk, you know. So
Yeah.
were there moments you almost gave up, and what kept you going when you transformed everything that you've been through and transformed it into a purpose, taking your pain and transformed it into purpose at a legislative level,
Hmm.
helping change child marriage laws in multiple states, which is amazing. And then what was it like to stand in front of lawmakers and speak your truth in that way?
Oh gosh. Yeah, the last question, my first response to that is it was terrifying. In part because of that imposter syndrome that I mentioned, right? And I think for me, what really set me free from that, and I still struggle with it, it's, healing is not a linear journey, right? It's one that takes so many twists and turns. And some days we are just on cloud nine and we know our strength and we know our worth. And then we have other days where we're like, yeah, can I find a rock to hide under because I am not feeling good about myself, right? But we have to understand that those things ebb and flow. And for me, what set me free was standing up and owning my story, owning all of it. My very first time speaking out was at a United Nations Association meeting. It was on human trafficking. So they had a big conference here in Kentucky on it. Our current governor, Andy Bashir, he was attorney general at the time, and he spoke at the conference. And I also spoke at the conference on the second day. I gave a 20-minute speech, entirely owned everything. I talked about working in the strip club. I talked about all the sexual exploitation. I talked about the early life sexual abuse. I talked about the fact that I didn't even have a 10th grade education, before going on to further that when I was in my 20s. I owned all of these things. And that became my superpower because if I can stand in front of people and say, yeah, all these really crappy things happened, but they don't define who I am, then if a person's going to judge me when I have already claimed my personal power and said I'm not going to judge myself, that's their issue. It's not on me. It's not going to define me. Now, that is the energy that I am able to take into situations when I'm meeting with lawmakers for the most part. It doesn't always happen though. I have had some people make some asinine comments to me, when lobbying, and the majority of people are very supportive, but some people, including people who proclaim to be feminist, have said things to me like, do you really think you're going to be able to change the law? Because man, you're naive if you do. Well, that just gives me more fire. I think one of the saving graces for me was being born with a very fiery spirit that sometimes can appear a little rebellious, but it's rebellion truly with a cause. Because if something's not right, we have the right to talk about that and to speak about that. I think the other part is knowing that if someone is going to reject something that you have to say, when you have the lived experience, you are the expert. And, I would challenge to say a lot of people with lived experience are far stronger experts than people who have multiple degrees, because lived experience is so much more valuable and should really be informing the systems that are set up to support our communities, whether that is, mental health, whether it's physical health, whether it is, child protective services, foster care institutions, laws. All of this needs expertise driven by lived experience survivors. So that's another thing that, was really cathartic for me to be able to have these experiences where I brave up, I talk to people, um, and then, if that imposter syndrome sets in, and I'm telling myself, okay, this is just for a day. It's just for a day. I'm going to feel better tomorrow.
Yes. Oh, agree so much with that. Okay. So, can you speak about what got you in the door of like going to, where did you change the laws?
hmm
What did that process look like? What got you in the door? And were you working at the time with a full-time job while doing this? So take us in, into a nice little short journey there if you can.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yes, I was working a full time job. At the time, my title was relationship manager. I was working for a company that administered flexible spending accounts. So, this is, tax advantage, consumer driven plans, right? Like very much a benefits orientation, very far removed from the work that I find myself in now. But the skills that I had developed to become really strong in my role were ones that I was able to take into the advocacy space as well. Especially that relationship management piece, the project management piece, the marketing that I had to learn, all of those things. So those really did help me to segue into advocacy. But while I was lobbying, I, yes, was working that full time job. I would actually take my work laptop with me because I had the ability to work remote some. So if I had a meeting in Frankfurt, which is the capital of Kentucky, I would take my laptop with me. I would meet with the legislators I was meeting with, and then go into a conference room where it was quiet, do my meeting for work, bounce out, to talk with more people. So it was very much a juggling act throughout that period of time. What got me through the door, though, to advocate to begin with, was the relationships that I started forming with these different organizations that were doing work on issues that were really important to me. I mentioned the United Nations Association. I became a board member with them. And again, I had spoken out at one of their conferences. Through that and through their involvement in advocacy work, I started getting involved in other groups as well. I formed a really great relationship with the School of Social Work at the University of Louisville. They helped me with a lot of the data analytics that we pulled back from the Office of Vital Statistics. They gave me a lot of speaking opportunities as well. And then this really helped me to, have to be taken seriously when it came to meeting with lawyers and with legislative officials. The other part that was really amazing at that time was that, I mentioned Andy Bashir, he's our governor now in Kentucky. And he was attorney general at the time that I met him back in 2018. And he appointed me to a survivors council here in Kentucky. It was the very first survivors council in our entire nation. And the goal of it was to bring together survivors of crime to be able to talk about their lived experience and to be able to have them plug into these different task forces that could inform the work of the task force. So we had folks on there that had survived gun violence. We had people that had, survived other forms of violent crime, domestic violence, sexual assault, and there were so many. And then, of course, myself having a few things, on the list, such as child marriage and sexual exploitation and child abuse as well. So to be able to give us that platform really elevated our voices. And it also gave me so much more confidence to be able to continue this type of work. What was interesting is that when I started lobbying in Kentucky, the state of Tennessee picked it up. And it was actually one of the senators in Tennessee called one of the senators in Kentucky and said, "Hey, we hear what you guys are doing to change child marriage laws there. Can you send us the bill language? We're interested in implementing something similar," because they had pressure put on them. The media was very much our friend in that regard. Um, and so, that's how we ended up getting both of those changed in the same legislative session. And then the state of Indiana, it was the same. The following session, we were able to take the progress we made. I drove up to Indianapolis and gave testimony there. And there are other states as well. I've driven to North Carolina. I've gone to Ohio. I mean, there's so many different places that I've plugged into and continue to for this type of work. I'll say for me, the reasons that Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana were my priorities. I was a resident of Kentucky when I was 16. My perpetrator lived in Indiana. That's where the behavioral health facility was that I was in when I was 14. And then the state of Tennessee is where I was actually married off at 16. And so for me, it was really important that I was able to address it on this, tri-state effective, basically, because I was taken across state lines and that became legal because a marriage license was issued. That's atrocious. The state of Indiana is where, for one thing, I didn't have access to protections after I was married. It was also the state that gave custody of my daughter to my predator. And as though that wasn't horrific enough, I was ordered to pay him child support. He literally took everything from me. And so, my way of reclaiming my power, in addition to casting that ripple of protection out to others, was to say these three states that were directly involved in, perpetuating my abuse, no other kid's going to go through that here because we're going to talk about it and we're going to make it illegal for that to happen to anyone else.
Ugh, again, you got me all teary eyed. That's so powerful and such great work and important work that you're doing. And
Thank
I
you.
just, you're just a beautiful soul, a beautiful human. And I'm so glad that you are, you have the wisdom and the capability to, and the drive and the fire to do this, because this is not an easy feat, and that the fact that you've done this in 3 states is amazing.
Thank you.
Um, I also wanted to ask, was your daughter okay living with him
Oh,
during those
no.
11 years?
No, no. So I will say when she first came to live with me, and this is so atrocious, she ended up being sent to a group home before I was able to get temporary custody because he got himself arrested. And he had made these wild accusations against his dad. And when the police came, he was acting off of his rocker. When the police came to arrest him, he had barricaded him and my daughter in the shed. And when they tried to get him out, they went to tase him and he used her as a human shield. I mean, it was just atrocious. But she had such a significant trauma bond with him that when she first came to live with me, she did not trust anything about me. And of course, he very much had contributed to a lot of that as well. Um, she is in her early 20s now, and we talk once in a while. Occasionally we will meet for dinner. It's still a very strained relationship, but I'm just thankful that we're in each other's lives and have the ability to grow that. But she has talked about the fact that, she very much sees how abusive he was. And she hasn't disclosed anything specific, but has very much alluded to the fact that, there were other abuses that had occurred aside from, him being so manipulative and so volatile and everything. So it's really heartbreaking to know that, that was the case for her. And, at that stage, as I was trying to rebuild, you know, myself, I wasn't in a position to be able to fight for her, take care of her. And in part, my advocacy work is very much, an attempt at being redemptive of that as well.
Does she see that work that you're doing, the advocacy work
Mhm.
you're doing? Okay.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and she has made a lot of very supportive comments about that as well. She knows I wrote a book. We've talked about that. We've talked about, the documentary that I did as well. She has very much seen all of that, and she knows I'm trying to, write the course for other people. I know she's proud. She has, very much said that as well, and I'm extremely proud of her for being the person that she is, especially knowing everything she came from. But it's one of those things where it's like, one of my missions in life is to break cycles of generational trauma. I wasn't able to do that for her when she was a child. It's something that, she and I are very much able to talk through now. And it's something I was very much able to break that cycle for my younger daughter. But that doesn't undo all the lost time that we had during her earlier life.
Yeah. You mentioned a documentary? You have it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that too. So sorry. Um, Back in, I believe it was aired in 2019, either 2018, 2019. But it's produced by A&E, and it's called I Was a Child Bride. It features me and a few other child marriage survivors, and we talk about, our direct experience with that. We are from various parts of the country as well, which I think was really strategic on the part of the network to show that child marriage isn't isolated to one pocket of the US. It's across. So it was really an honor to be part of that documentary. I don't anticipate that it'll be the last push that happens. I think as much as we can get the word out there through various means, the more room that we have to really change laws and policies.
Yeah, and for listeners, I will find it and tag it or link it in the notes. For listeners who have survived trauma but are still in the ashes phase, what would you say to them right now in this moment as someone who's been there?
Yes, that is such a powerful question. I think my best guidance on that is that where you are right now is okay. You don't have to beat yourself up for not being at some, point that you envision getting to. You can hold on to that dream. You can hold on to that vision and you can absolutely make it a reality. But you don't have to judge yourself for not being there right now because there is a lot to be said for just sitting with your pain and allowing that to move through you. A lot of times it has to be felt before it can be released. And so if you feel that you are in, that space where you're sitting in the ashes right now, just know that as you allow yourself to feel that, and as you allow yourself to tune in to whatever higher power it is you believe in, whether that's through nature or, religion or what have you will end up kindling that into something that does become transformational. But you have to be able to feel it first. And where you are is perfectly okay.
Looking back on your journey, when would you say you were in the red, and when did you finally step into the black? The place of purpose, abundance, and clarity. So that came from a financial term of red being negative and black in the positive.
Oh, that's such a great question. I think for me, honestly, being in the red has been all the times that I've engaged in self harming behavior. And I'll share with you, I don't think that that's just limited to, things that most people would think of, whether it's drinking too much or, you know, uh, going and smoking pot or whatever. Part of it is how do we take care of ourselves day to day? Am I making sure that I get enough sleep? Am I eating the proper nutrition? Am I surrounding myself with relationships that are uplifting and empowering rather than ones that drag me down? And I'll tell you, before I met my current husband, I spent so much time chasing people that I had to convince my worth to. And so much of that was just me repeating the trauma of my past. Letting that go, realizing I'm worthy just as I am, that is what moved me into the black. And that is what became the, stage that my superpower launched from, really.
That is so well said again. Got me over here trying to hold back tears. Oh, so beautiful.
Thank you.
Ah, okay. If you could give one piece of advice to someone ready to transform their trauma into purpose, what would it be?
Hmm. Goodness. There's so many. um, I think one of the most powerful statements that I have heard is if you don't face your demons, they end up raising your kids. And I think that that is so true. That is how we end up perpetuating those cycles of generational pain and generational trauma. Being willing to be self reflective and being willing to do the work on ourselves is what really starts changing those cycles. And I also would say for anyone that is questioning what their purpose is in life, a lot of times the most powerful way to find that is to look at our pain and to look at the circumstances that happened that made us carry this inner dialogue that we're not good enough or that, there's something wrong with us. If we can look at that and heal that, then we have found the way to take our healing and ripple that out to other people.
Yes, yes, yes. So good. And then finally, where can our audience connect with you, support your work, or invite you to speak?
Yes, so I can be reached at trauma2purpose.com. That is my website. I can also be reached directly through email at Donna at trauma2purpose.com. That's the number two in there. And I invite anyone to connect with me, whether, you would like to extend an invitation for me to speak or even to talk about anything you've heard today. I also would love to hear from you if you want to get involved in the advocacy efforts to end child marriage in our country. I'm also working on some things that would increase the statute of limitations and reporting early childhood abuse. There are several states that have extremely tight windows that one can report in. And I think that really needs to be expanded as well, especially with the age of disclosure averaging 52 years old. So if you would like to talk about that as well, please feel free to email me. Again, that's Donna at trauma2purpose.com.
Oh my goodness. It was just so great having you on my podcast today. Thank you so much for sharing so much of your story and your mission in life and all the wonderful things that you're doing. I hope that our journeys somehow or another lift each other up or maybe help each other out in some way. But I do love what you're doing, and I hope that we shine light onto your mission. And yeah, I just thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's truly such an honor to be able to be on your show. And I appreciate all the questions and, all of the encouraging words as well. And just love what you're doing for the community.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being here. If something you heard today moved you, share it with someone you love. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can follow me on Instagram at In the Black Passion Project for more behind the scenes and guest spotlights. And remember, no matter where you've been, you're not behind. You're becoming. Stay in the black.